I got time for us to go ahead and start, so we'll finish up Genesis 18 this morning and get into 19. I would hope, we'll see. Go with me to Genesis chapter 18 then. Okay, Abraham and Sarah are visited. We're in Genesis 18, starting about verse 9. They're visited by some angels, and they tell them that you're going to have a child, you're going to have a son next year about such and such a time. And it's mentioned verse 15 that Sarah says, I didn't laugh, and they said, yes, you did. Anyway, I'm sure there's more of that conversation than we have. That's how I feel about a lot of things as I read through the book of Genesis. I'd like to know a lot more. But anyway, it said that the men rose up and they looked towards Sodom. And Abraham, this is verse 16, chapter 18, verse 16. They rose up from thence, that is, from there, and they looked toward Sodom. They're on the plains of Mamre out here. Hebron is nearby. But anyway, here, that's what we have in the way of geography. So after the men got up and they looked toward Sodom, that's two of them, the angels, Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. I take that to mean much like we do today. If we have somebody visiting us and they stand up and they say, well, we need to go, what do you do usually? I would guess you probably stand up and accompany them to the door, maybe even outside if the weather's a little bit warmer than today. You'll accompany them outside. In other words, you're helping them on the way. I guess that's what that means in verse 16. And as that's happening, now they're gone, the two angels, they're going to be heading toward Sodom. They're leaving Abraham, and Abraham has a discussion with the Lord, or with God. Note that the question seems to be, in verse 17, seems that Abraham is standing nearby, and the person with him is called the Lord at times, meaning probably Jesus Christ before he came incarnate in the flesh. But anyway, that's a probably. But look at verse 17, Genesis 18, verse 17. The Lord said, who's he talking to? I don't really know. I think that we're getting a kind of an appraisal here by the writer of the book as he's writing this down. But it's sort of like the Lord says this to himself. He's thinking out loud, probably hoping that Abraham is going to be hearing. But anyway, shall I hide this from Abraham, what I'm planning to do to Sodom and Gomorrah? And then he said, after all, verse 18, Abraham is going to have a great nation coming from him and his descendants. They're all going to be blessed in him. And then he gives a compliment. Wouldn't you like to have this said about you? The Lord says, I know Abraham. I know him. I know that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment. That's his estimation of Abraham, God's estimation. And then it says in verse 20, and the Lord said, because of the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great. I wish there was a lot more said than that, but that's enough for us to get the general scenario of what's happening here. The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grievous. It's well known. It's corrupted the entire area. They're getting worse and worse and worse. Now, the purpose of our having Bible study is to find out what God thinks about certain things. What do you think that God thinks about the subject of homosexuality? Is that not well, whenever the subject comes up in the media, people talking about it, it gets the Passover treatment. They just pass over it. They don't want to cover it. They just as soon not talk about it. And yet that's what the whole chapter 19 is all about. How does God feel? He just told you. The sin is very grievous. He's going to give some examples of that in just a moment, but God's had it up to here. Remember what he did to Noah's people in his day? Just 8 souls were saved in that ark, and the other teeming millions died. And then he made an appearance again in chapter 11. And we find there that they planned on building the tower up toward heaven. God stopped that. He intervened. Miraculously caused them to not be able to communicate with each other, change their language. So all of a sudden they couldn't even talk to their own relatives. So all they were left to do is just scatter. And those who did speak that language, they would gravitate toward that language they were familiar with. And so we had the beginning of languages. God took care of that miraculously. God's going to move again in chapter 19. It's a miracle. We already told you why God did it. He said, the sin is grievous. Verse 21, I'm going down now and see what they've done, and see if it's all together according to the cry that he's hearing, which has come unto me, and if not, I'll know. Now, first of all, is not God omniscient? Doesn't God already know all of this? Yes. Why is he coming down? Not for his benefit, but primarily for man's benefit. So they could tell people, look, here's what God said and here's what God did. I'm sure that there were hundreds and hundreds of people that did not like what they were going to hear. But nonetheless, that doesn't change God's mind. Verse 22, and the men turned their faces from there. The men, we're talking about the angels. There were 3 of them. One of them stayed back with Abraham. The other 2 left and headed towards Sodom. That's what we have in verse 23. They went towards Sodom, and yet Abraham stood before the Lord. And I'll not get into it, but we discussed it last week. Notice the Lord was in physical form. In other words, very likely Jesus Christ before he became flesh. He was back in the Old Testament days. He was there various times, but here I think it's pretty probable that that's who it is. Okay, he has a discussion with the Lord, or the pre-incarnate Christ, and he's asked, will you destroy the righteous right along with the wicked when you bring destruction upon Sodom and Gomorrah? I mean, peradventure, if it's the case that there are 50 righteous souls in this area, you still destroy it? And God said, no, I'll go along with you, for you can find 50 righteous souls, it will not be destroyed. Well, how about 45? We call this Jewing him. He's trying to Jew God down. How about 40? 30? 20? 10? Yes, for the sake of 10 righteous souls, I'll withhold the judgment. But they didn't have that many, and destruction was going to come. Verse 33, the Lord went his way, and as soon as he left off communicating and talking with Abraham, he went his way, and Abraham returned unto his place. Okay, now, Lot. We go to Lot. This happens to Abraham probably maybe 50 miles away. I don't know how far it was to the plains of Mamre. But remember the verses that I gave you last week. Genesis 13, verse 12 says that Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom. He was close by. And then chapter 14 and verse 12 says that he is dwelling in Sodom. And then chapter 19 and verse 1 says he's in the gates of the city. He's now probably, I guess that means he's a magistrate of some sort. He's worked his way up to that level, sitting in the gates of the city, rendering decisions on various issues. He thought the people really, 100% evidently, will accept me for what I am. So that righteous man Lot, Peter says, 2 Peter 2 and verse 8, dwelt among them, seeing and watching their living, and it vexed his righteous soul. It vexed. When you vex somebody, what do? You trouble them. That's what Peter says, that he was troubled because of the unlawful deeds of the way these people were acting. That's what he was putting up with to a point, and then God had enough. Now, Lot sits in the gate, starting in chapter 19, 2 angels. And notice it says, there came 2 angels. And I looked in some of the other Bibles that I have, even the New American Standard, and it says, and the 2 angels. well, it's there in the American Standard. That's the way it is in the Hebrew. The article, the, is there. Not just, there came two angels, but the two angels. Which ones? The one that were there before with Abraham and left and went on in toward Sodom. Those two angels came to Sodom in the evening. And Lot, this is chapter 19:1, Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. And there he was at the entrance, so he saw who was coming in and out. And he rose up to meet them, bowed down before them, and said, "Behold now my lords," plural. He recognized something about them was different. And he said, "Turn in, I pray you, to your servant's house. Come home with me and spend the night. And you can wash your feet, you can clean up, and then head out tomorrow morning early." And their response was, "No thanks. We'll spend the night here on the streets." Did they know what it was like to be on the streets of Sodom? Anyway, they said, "No, we'll spend the night outside here in Sodom on the street." And that's verse 2. He pressed them greatly. They turned in unto him. They went into his house, and he made them a feast. Incidentally, any mention made yet of Lot's wife? Probably, I'm guessing here, the Bible doesn't say this, but I'm guessing that Lot's wife didn't appreciate all this too much. Lot asking these strangers to come home into their house, and now he fixes a meal for them. Why isn't she fixing a meal? Maybe she let her resentment be made known. I don't know. But anyway, he made a feast, baked this bread, they ate. But before they lay down, hadn't even got to bed yet. Verse 4 says, "The men of the city, even the men of Sodom, surrounded the house." Notice how thorough it was. Both young and old men, until all the people from every quarter section of the city, people were involved from every part of the city. They turned out and they called Lot, verse 5, and said, "Where are the men that came into you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Beloved, that doesn't mean so we can get acquainted. Bring them out so we can know them. We're going to have that term "know" used even, I think, here in this same chapter, talking about the heterosexual relationship. But this is talking about a homosexual relationship. To know them sexually, in other words. Bring them out so we may know them. And Lot went out at the door unto them, and he shut the door. Now notice, this is not like the tent that Abraham was in. This had some kind of more of a physical structure. I don't know, I'm sure it wasn't a 4-bedroom, 3-bath house, but it was not a tent because it had a door on the tent. And this is not a tent flap, the entrance to a tent or the exit from the tent, but it was a door. And I read that they have discovered, archaeologists have discovered that there have been some gigantic hinges discovered in this area. So they had hinges, even though they perhaps were crude. But anyway, they came to that door, and Lot went out at the door to them, and he shut the door after him, and he talked to the men outside, and he said, I pray you, brethren, do not act so wickedly. Do not carry through on what you all have in mind. Now, how do you think that's going to be accepted by the majority of those people assembled there? About like rain on the parade for homosexuals today. You don't rain on their parade. So here you have him begging and pleading with them, do not act so wickedly. But they're not going to be listening to him now, even though he may have been a magistrate in the city. And look at what he says in verse 8. I mean, this just blows your mind. I have 2 daughters, Lot says, that have not known man. Now, people, they were acquainted with a lot of individuals, no doubt, but we're not talking about that. This word to know means to know sexually. I have 2 daughters that have not known men. Let me, I pray you, bring them out, my daughters, bring them out to you, and do unto them what's good in your eyes. But to these men, don't do anything to these men, because they came under the shadow of my roof. First of all, I would ask, can he do both? Could not Lot, and he did stand up to the men. He was ready to put his body at risk when he was outside with them outside the door and say, look, no, you can't do this. They didn't like it. I know, because it says, look at verse 9. This one fellow, they're talking about Lot, their friend. This fellow came in to sojourn. He's not a permanent resident here. He's just a visitor. And he thinks he's going to be a judge and tell us how we have to live. Nobody tells me how I'm going to live. I'll do what I want to do. That's the attitude. And then they say, okay, Lot, we're going to deal worse with you than we planned to deal with your 2 visitors. Uh-oh, now Lot's in trouble. But the men, remember, were angels. And it said in verse 10, the men put forth their hand, pulled Lot into the house, and shut the door. Now, he's developed some backbone, and he's not going to permit them to make use of the men this way. Notice what they wanted to do. You can read that in the last 3 or 4 verses. I want you to turn, if you will, to Judges chapter 19. Last week when Johnny was here, the son-in-law to Doug and Doug and his wife, what happened? Watch what it says in Judges 19, verse 22. And this, remember, is almost 400 years after what happened right here in Genesis. I'll get there in a minute. Okay, Judges 19. We're at Gibeah. You can see back in verse 14. And the children of Israel are having some problems with each other. But go on down to verse 22 through 24. Now, as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, certain sons of Belial, in other words, Satan, the devil, certain sons of Belial, beset the house round about, and beat on the door, and spake to the master of the house, the old man, and they said, bring forth the man that came into your house, that we may know him. 400 years they hadn't learned much. It's still going on. Incidentally, 2,000 years later, in our day and time, it's still going on. But bring forth the man that we may know him. And verse 23 says, and the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, no, my brethren, do not, I pray you, do so wickedly. That's almost word for word what we have back here in Genesis. 400 years later, still happening. Seeing that this man is come into my house, do not do this folly. Evidently, that was a strong point of culture back in those days. If somebody comes into your house, you're responsible for their well-being as long as they're there. In both cases, who've come into my house or come into my door, whichever the expression is, it means the same thing. So that's a good thing. We ought to be concerned about that. Lot should have been concerned about it 400 years earlier, and he was. But he turned right around and offered his two virgin daughters to that crowd of vulgarians. They wanted to sexually abuse her, and he says, I have two virgin daughters. Take them and do what you will, but don't touch these men. How could anybody today, well, they wouldn't today, surely, except some areas of our world would. But you want to know what God thinks about homosexuality? We've got it right here in chapter 19 of Genesis. We have it in Judges. Same thing. Now, what does God think about homosexuality? Well, have you heard about the gay liberation movement? Have you heard about the parade they've had in New York and various places? Even political organizations are now backing up one type of this gay activity. Does God change his mind just like that? Anyway, in the first century he hadn't. Listen to Romans chapter 1. The Apostle Paul, by inspiration of God now, says in Romans 1, verse 26, God gave them up in the first century. God gave them up to vile affection, for even their women changed the natural use into that which is against nature. In other words, unnatural. And likewise the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves the recompense of the error which was meet or suitable. That's pretty plain. But let's go back to Sodom. That's an unbelievable statement that he made to these rioting men, homosexuals. Use my 2 virgin daughters. How could he do that? As I read this morning, I thought to myself, can't you do both? Can't you take care of the men that you've let into your house and spending the night? Can't you help with their well-being? And at the same time, treat your daughters with great respect? Why must it be one or the other? Why cannot it be both and? Well, anyway, why would he do that? All I can do is conjecture. First of all, remember that this was a emergency type situation for him. He had no way to prepare. I mean, he didn't sit down and work out his lesson and write down his major points that he wants to make. He didn't have time. They were there and they made the demand and said, hey, this is the way it's going to be. So he had some courage use his own body to shield the men as he shut the door behind them. They could not get in the house, get the men. So that meant he should have used that same type of physical presence against these guys outside. But it does tell me he still had some influence over his household, because notice these 2 daughters were virgins. That's interesting. 2 virgin daughters. No doubt that's because of Sodom's influence, that righteous man teaching his children how they ought to respect God. So he had some influence over his own family, and hopefully over some of the men of the city. But Lot came to the realization that this is a dire situation. My safety is here at risk. He'd been sitting in the gate for some time, making decisions. They knew that. They refer to that right here. Now he thinks he's going to judge us and tell us how we are to live. They resented then the very fact that Lot believed that their actions were sinful and wrong. That made them mad. I don't think 2,000 years, 3,000 years has changed very much. It still makes people very upset when you condemn their lifestyle. That something is morally wrong. But anyway, these 2 angels took care of the thing. They struck all of these men. I don't know how many. It could have been they were maybe up to 100 or more outside that house, demonstrating, let us in. But the angels took care of it. They struck every one of them blind. Now, turn to Acts 13, verse 11. The Apostle Paul, in the 1st century, 1,000 years later, the Apostle Paul did the same thing he struck a man blind. Usually miracles were for the purpose of bettering a person's health. But there were times like Elymas, the sorcerer, there were times when they too were struck blind. That's a miracle. Instead of healing the blind, they struck men blind. Well, that's what happened back here in Genesis. They struck the whole lot of them blind. You also see that in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 18, when God smote the Syrian army and struck all them blind. Okay, now, so far as the record goes, Lot evidently didn't even bother to warn his own boys about what's going to happen. Lot was told Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, and originally even Zoar, all 5 cities were going to be destroyed. Ended up just being 4 because Zoar was not destroyed because Abraham pleaded with God, let us have some little city. After all, Zoar is very little, isn't it, God? God said, okay, you can have Zoar to live in. But it's not recorded anywhere where Lot warned his own sons what was going to happen. I wonder about that. Why? Why did he not warn them? Was it because, for example, they were so deeply involved in their wickedness and immorality that he knew there was no change in them now? And he gave up on his own sons? I don't know. Maybe he thought it would be useless, wasted effort. But I'll tell you what, if that's the case, this is a very sobering example of the results of a father's compromising morality in front of his own children. Whenever dad begins to live a life that's not up to where it ought to be, that's going to have some kind of effect on his children, negative. Well, we see that right here, probably in the case of Lot's children, his sons. At least his 2 daughters that were virgins, they escaped with Lot and his wife. She didn't escape very long, though, outside the city, as we'll show in just a moment. Verse 15, any comments or questions? Genesis 19:15. It's morning now. They spent the night. The angels hurried Lot. Come on, Lot, we're wasting time. Get your wife, your 2 daughters, which are here, lest they be consumed with the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, he's still holding back. He's lagging. I can't help but wonder if he's lagging behind because his wife is. But anyway, while he lingered, the men got hold of his hand, his wife's hand, the 2 daughters' hands, and led all 4 of them out of the city and set them outside the city. Verse 17, it came to pass, when they had brought them out, he said, escape for your life. Do not look behind you. Do not stay in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be consumed. And Lot is going to bargain with God like Abraham bargained. Lot's going to say, oh, not so, my Lord. Surely you're not going to destroy all of them. Your servant, if I have found grace in your sight, and you have shown your great mercy. You showed that in saving my life. I cannot escape to the mountain because some evil will take me and I'll die. So he was afraid to go to the mountainous area. Behold now, this city is near to flee unto, and it is a little one after all. It's a little city. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live. And he said, I have accepted you concerning this also. I will not overthrow Zoar, just as you have spoken. So escape and go there, verse 22 says, because I can't do anything until you get out of here. Therefore, the name of that city is called Zoar. Incidentally, it's morning now, verse 23. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar. So God spared Zoar. I still think that Lot's wife was probably using her delaying tactics as best she could, as long as she could. But I wonder what happens when she gets to Zoar. Surely by this time some runners may have escaped and come to Zoar and told them what's going on back at Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah are south of Zoar. Admah and Zeboim are north of this little city of Zoar. So what we're saying, Zoar is right in the big middle of the destruction. On the south, Sodom and Gomorrah. On the north, Admah and Zeboim. And here they were in Zoar. Okay, verse 24, it starts. The Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from out of heaven. Look at that verse. You notice that the word the Lord is used twice. The Lord rained on heaven and fire from the Lord out of heaven. It's possible we're talking about two lords here. That it's possible that the Lord down here had talked to Abraham. We know him as the Son of God. Had talked to his Father in heaven and said, okay, it's time now. And so the Lord in heaven rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah. They're overthrown, verse 25 says, all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities. I wonder what the people in Zoar thought about Lot and his wife and daughters. Are you thinking maybe that they're upset? Why did you all escape and everybody else didn't? I mean, that's just the human element in me. I'd like to know, but the Bible simply didn't tell what they were thinking. But he overthrew those cities. Verse 26, this is found in the New Testament in Luke chapter 17. But his wife looked back from behind him. Now get it, how far behind? I don't know, but she's lagging even further behind Lot. It says she was behind him, and she, from that position of being behind him, she looked back at the fire and brimstone coming down, and she became a pillar of salt. And Jesus said in the New Testament, remember Lot's wife. We'll pick up here next week.